Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Shoma Chaudhary Lahiri and I teach Sociology at St. Xavier's College, Kolkata. Today I'll be talking to you about environmental movements in India, which forms a module of the larger paper on social movements in India. Now, the objective of this module would be to look at the various forms of environmental movements and the shifts in the nature of environmental movements in India since the time of its emergence. These shifts also reflect a change in the way in which modes of governance by the state and developmental policies of the state have undergone a change and affected the spread, the focus of environmental movements that have raged in different parts of the country. It would also focus on the sociological significance of environmental movements, the various forms of protests, the nature of organization, the forms of protests, and the significance of the movements, environmental movements in particular. Now, when one talks of environmental movements, one immediately goes back to the 1970s onwards. It is not that there were no environmental movements before. Environmental movements in India emerged from the 1970s onwards as critiques of state-sponsored forms of development. It is not that there were no environmental movements earlier, but they were not termed as environmental movements as such. But what is interesting about environmental movements is the varied nature of frameworks, a large plethora of actors, ways of thinking, ways of mobilizing, and the kinds of issues that the environmental movements have taken up. Generally, these movements have resisted increasing commodification and monopolization of resources, of natural resources, and their unsustainable use and unequal distribution, exploitative power relations, and the disempowerment of communities as a result. So, in other words, natural resource-based conflicts lie at the heart of environmental movements. Now, there's a difference in the focus and the nature of themes of environmental movements in the West and those in India. Now, in the West, environmental movements have generally engaged themselves in bringing to the fore issues of conservation, issues of quality of life, generally what are termed as post-materialist values. They have been largely termed as niche and elitist in character as a result. Whereas environmental movements in India have raised certain basic questions. They have protested against unsustainable resource use, which has implicated people from the upper classes as much as the state, and the impact of such developmental policies on different categories of people, namely tribals, peasants, forest dwellers, fishermen, and so on, workers, and so on. Therefore, though environmental movements have not been limited, the issue of environment cannot be sort of restricted to a particular class. The effect of environmental degradation has been felt more acutely by a certain section of people, namely the poor, people who are more who are closer to the environment, in the sense that they are more dependent on the environment for the sake of livelihood. In fact, Ranjit Dwivedi has termed the environmental movement in India as an envelope, as it encompasses a variety of socially and discursively constructed ideologies and actions, theories and practices. The range is so vast that it makes the study of environmental movements an interesting exercise in itself. Environmental movements in India in the colonial period, as I have earlier mentioned, were not known as environmental movements. However, the policies of the colonial state to use the indigenous resources, or to use resources available, natural resources in an intensive manner, led to the curtailment of the customary rights of people over these resources. They restricted access to forests, access to common property resources, access to forest produce, access to common land, and this led to prolonged fights and social conflicts, initially in the form of peasant rebellions, but later on the ecological component was added to it in the post-independence period. Now, I'll mention one of the earliest environmental movements that happened in Mulshi, which later on has been included in the as an environmental movement. It was called the Mulshi Rebellion, whereby the Tatars wanted to acquire land in the Pune region to build a power supply station which would supply power to the city of Bombay. Now, they began to acquire land, and this was resisted by the common people. Senapati Bapat, a congressman who lived in that area, gave leadership and managed to stall the creation of the project for almost nearly a year. But when the Tatars, when the Tatars, with the help of the colonial state, intervened by offering compensation to the Brahmin landlords of Pune who owned land at Mulshi, there was obviously a split in the rebellion. These landlords wanted to do away with the land, and they were paid a handsome compensation for it, while the local people of the area who cultivated the land, who were dependent on the land in different ways for their sources of livelihood, they were the people who continued to resist. This the rebellion was not successful in the sense that the Tatars were allowed to continue to build the power supply station, but this has been hailed as one of the earliest forms of environmental revolts in the colonial period. Now, in independent India, in the name of development, a number of such natural resource based conflicts emerged, and some of the notable forms of conflicts I will soon mention, but generally the policies of the state have been largely responsible for the emergence of environmental conflicts in different parts of the country. Though the demands of the conflicts, demands of the environmental movements have not been restricted to just restoration of their control, people's control over their resources. They have raised much more basic questions about resource use, about alternative forms of development, about the rapacious policies of the state, and so on. In the context of globalization, one witnesses different kinds of mobilization around the issue of environment, but these have happened because of the withdrawal of the state from and allowing private capital to invest in people's lands mounting and increasing assault on nature and natural resources with a complete disregard of the people who are dependent on such resources. And therefore, this has led to environmental conflicts in different parts of the country, especially in Orissa, around Orissa, Jharkhand, and other areas around mining, around water, around unsustainable use of forest resources, and so on. I'll talk about three forms of conflicts in this module. Conflicts over forests, conflicts over mining, mineral resources, and conflicts over water resources. Now, if one were to talk of forest-based conflicts, traditionally forests have supported communities. The idea that forests have emerged at the interstices of civilization, and the outskirts of human settlements, is not completely true. In fact, forests themselves have housed different kinds of communities, and conflicts over forests have largely been around access to forest produce, minor forest produce, fuel, firewood, etc., on which people are sort of dependent on a day-to-day basis. Now, acquisition of forests on one hand, clearing up forests, and a shift to commercial forestry on the other by the state has deprived the communities not only access to forest and forest produce, but it has also affected their survival. I'll give the example of Chipko movement in the 1970s, which people like Ramchandra Guha and many others have documented, and which has been hailed as one of a movement which has had far-reaching impact on the environmental movements, environmental consciousness in the subsequent years, has been about access to forest produce, access to who uses the forests and for whose benefits, who sacrifices the resources and for whose benefits. The controversy was around the dissatisfaction of the hill peasantry in the Uttarakhand region over giving away the right to use the woods from trees to a sports company, depriving them of this right. The women of the region brought in a different perspective to the movement altogether. They hugged the trees, which came to be known as Chipko, and they tried to raise issues of sustainability, not only access to forest produce, but issues of sustainability by raising slogans like Jal Jangal aur Jameen ye ho janata ke adheen. These issues led to the successful resolution of the Chipko movement, in the sense that the state was then forced to cancel their earlier orders of granting the access to forests of the region to a sports company. Now, post-globalization, the nature of forest clearance has been tremendous, at a tremendous speed. This is because the state has not intervened to safeguard the forests. In many cases, the state national parks and other sanctuaries were built to ensure that forests regenerate naturally, but by keeping people out of the sanctuaries or out of the forest areas has only been detrimental, in the sense that people's access to forest, people's knowledge over forest regarding forest produce, people's stakes over the resource use or the natural resources that they have been using for centuries now, that has been affected their morale has been eroded. With globalization, the slogan of development at all costs and development with the help of private capital has not only affected the environmental sustainability, but also affected the people who are dependent on it, the communities who are dependent on it, by curtailing their rights over the resources that they use or they live in close contact with, namely in the Himalayas, Central Indian region, Western Ghats, and such other places, and have caused a lot of environmental damage. While some of these efforts, for example, in the Central Indian region of the Doon Valley, some of these efforts could be stopped by the intervention of the Supreme Court. In many other cases, cases of mining, of quarrying, escaped media attention, escaped the attention of the judiciary, and managed to wreak havoc on the environmental base of the people. In cases where the judiciary intervened, mining could be stopped, whereas in many other cases, whole area, the stretch where mining was undertaken, was laid waste, and it remains barren. Now, for example, in the mineral-rich state of Orissa, in the recent years, in the context of globalization, many people's struggles around mining have taken place. The state, these areas which are mineral-rich are places where the tribals live. The Dongriya Konds of the region live in the Niyamgiri hills. The state has invited companies like Vedanta and Balco and Nalco and other such groups to mine bauxite, aluminium which is derived from bauxite ores, and all the areas are under the control of the tribals who have resisted such attempts. Now the government, there have been a number of people's resistance movements at Kashipur, Niyamgiri, Kalinganagar, Jagat Singhpur, by people who stand to lose their land, their livelihoods, their religious and cultural rights to foreign multinational companies like Vedanta and POSCO. The state promises to give them to give cheap power and easy access to raw materials, but often this has been at the cost of people's autonomy, people's rights, people's identities, and so on. A third kind of set of movements in the field of environment has been around the unsustainable use of water, and this water crisis continues to loom large and will emerge as one of the very a crisis, a problem which would be difficult to resolve in the future years. It began with the river valley projects, harnessing of water for large river valley projects, which led to the displacement of large number of people who Ramchandra Guha goes on to term as ecological refugees in the arena of development. And these, so Narmada Bachao Andolan and such other movements protesting displacement have led to not only displacement of agricultural lands on a large scale, affecting the material basis of survival of a large number of peasants and tribals in different areas. People's movements have also been witnessed in Bedthi, in Champalli, Koelkaro, Narmada and Lower Subanshri hydroelectric projects in the northeastern parts of the country in Brahmaputra, on the Brahmaputra in Assam. So therefore, environmental movements have happened around the issue of waterlogging. They have happened around the issue of desertification. They have happened around the issue of salinization and such, and the complete waste of the command areas around dams. these, of course, have been documented. What is also important to recognize in this context is the role of local action groups in Maharashtra, for example, like Pani Panchayats or Multi Sangharsh, who have been advocating sustainable use of water resources by people at the local level. Now, one would quickly go on to talk about the frameworks and typologies that the environmental movements has used. And some of these typologies are sometimes based on the nature of people who participate. Sometimes these typologies are based on the nature of goals. But generally, although typologies, as I have mentioned earlier, bring order into the larger social movements, a vast plethora of social movements, but they also pose certain limits. Now, the problem with typologies and classifications is that there are significant overlaps, and often it becomes difficult to classify a movement as either environmental or tribal, or because the participants are could be tribals, could be workers, could be peasants. So whether one should call them tribal movements or environmental movements is not clear, or the overlap, as in Chipko, over environmental issues and peasant issues. So therefore, typologies have their limits as well as their uses. Now, another important aspect to consider about environmental movement is the multiplicity of strategies of protest that environmental movements have used. Largely, environmental movements in India have used nonviolence as a strategy, drawing from Gandhian principles, and these nonviolent movements have been effective. The strategies of protests are local, they're indigenous, and they strike a chord in the heart of the participants, and the strategies are some of the strategies of protest has been in the form of padayatras, in the form of satyagraha, in the form of dharnas, petitioning, jal satyagrahas, cycle yatras. So most of them have been innovative, and they have met with varying degrees of success. They are seen in different parts of different kinds of environmental movements, and they have managed to garner the attention of the local population, the affected population, or even the population beyond the those affected, the media, the judiciary, or even in some cases the state as well. Now, I want to conclude by talking about the significance of environmental movements. Now, environmental movements, the significance of environmental movements, therefore, if one goes through the content, one would realize further, it lies in 3 or 4 dimensions. One is environmental movements lay bare the contradictions at the heart of capitalism. The kind of capitalistic resource use and the impact of such resource use on the people in eroding their base of subsistence and livelihood has been expressed by the environmental movements. The second dimension about environmental movements, the significance of such movements is that they bring a new dimension, a new understanding to democracy and civil society by involving a plethora of actors, a wide variety of actors, as well as a wide variety of protests. The forms of protests are all innovative, creative, and the categories of people who participate in such protests are of a wide variety. And therefore, democracy gets a new meaning through these social movements. Finally, environmental movements have also posed a challenge to the meaning, content, and pattern of development. They, in fact, their significance lies in the fact that they have raised certain basic conflicts over time, over natural resources, over voices, over forms of expression, and over identity. For more details regarding the environmental movements, please consult the EPG Pathshala website.